Well, that
Today
maybe
we're really fortunate to have Charlie Hall. Charlie in a moment is going to explain where he comes from and what he's doing now. David Tilley is here as usual, and I'm Mark Brown. So let's start. Charlie, it's wonderful that you're joining us. This is a new endeavor for the two of us, for the three of us actually, and I'm very interested to get into lots of different questions. But I want to start with just your professional career. You were faculty at SUNY, if I remember correctly, and now are retired. So have at it. Tell us where you've been and where you are now.
well, I was a kid. I grew up south of Boston, on the coast, Hingham, Massachusetts. And as a kid, I was mostly interested in fishing and also bird hunting. And I was outdoors all the time. And with face mask, looking underwater. And I was just totally interested in the living world, I guess, and the wet world. And even though I grew up on the ocean, within a mile of the ocean, my interests were especially in fresh water. And then I went to a liberal arts college, Colgate, where retrospectively, well, I knew it at the time, I got a hell of a good basic introduction to, I don't know, life, literature and art and all that artsy fartsy stuff. And also the basics of science, chemistry and physics and stuff. And I was a literature major actually to begin with, not really knowing what I wanted to do. And then there was somebody said to me when I was, I suppose, end of my sophomore year, what are you doing tomorrow afternoon? And I said, I don't know, go fishing or whatever, which is normally what I did. And he said, this is guy coming and talking about ecology. And this was in 1963. And I said, ecology, what's that? And he says, it's about swamps. You'll love it. And so I went, and it was a guy, Art Cooper from North Carolina State, who was an ecologist at that institution at the time. And he had gone to Colgate and gone on and got his PhD, I think, at Michigan, and was teaching at North Carolina State. But he showed pictures of he and his students out in a coastal environment, in Spartina environment, which is where I grew up, so I could connect with it, with chemistry equipment and nets and various devices. And I remember sitting there in that hour and saying, you mean you can make your living outdoors? And I was fascinated. And from that hour until this hour, my life has been a straight line. I've been wanting to be an ecologist. So after Colgate, I took a map of the United States and I drew a map, which was damn cold. Colgate was really cold in those days and probably still. And I drew a line of the southern distribution of trout. And applied to Penn State and a couple other places. And I got into Penn State, where I was, I would say, initially not a distinguished student. But on my GREs, I tested off the charts. So, and I can remember my advisor, Ed Cooper, who was a good fish guy, and that's what I knew. I did my master's on mayflies and what was their oxygen tolerance and so forth. And I said, and I remember him bringing me into his office towards the end of my time there and saying, Charlie, I know you want to get a PhD and I know you're smart enough and maybe I think you work hard enough. He said, but why don't you just take a couple of years off and grow up? And I'm sitting there and thinking, and be like you, no way. And so maybe that was one of the things that appealed to me most about Odum. In a certain sense, he had this childlike wonder. He never grew up, really. I mean, in some ways, he was extremely responsible and mature, and other ways, he was open. So while I was, it's a little more complicated, but essentially, I went down and interviewed in Chapel Hill, and I came in to his office, and he's the Odum line was there. You have an Odum line at Florida, people following around behind, waiting their turn. And I got in this Odum line, and I had no idea what he looked like. And here's this enormous guy. And I was pretty big. I was 6'2", and he towered over me, and I had red hair and green teeth, and it was quite something. And this is a true story, Mark. This is an amazing story. So I guess people should understand this is kind of how it was. He said, are you doing any? He said, can you come with me I got to go to the hardware store. And I said, sure, I was ready for anything. I knew who he was. I'd read his papers, and I knew he and his brother were famous, but I didn't really never met anybody like this before. And so he goes out to this little red Volkswagen and somehow gets his big body in this Volkswagen. And I get in there next to him, and we drive in Chapel Hill. We drive down the hill to the hardware store. And this is when the hardware stores were just becoming sort of domestic, for that. And he comes there and he wants to get some equipment for his daughter to do a science project, and which was he was going to put an ecosystem and expose it to the effluent, the exhaust of his Volkswagen. So, but the guy at the counter was busy. So, honest to God, this happened. He's looking at all these domestic items out there, and there's a goldfish bowl, and there's a record player, and there's a fan. I don't know what else was there. But he says, look, I'll show you how we can simulate the Gulf Stream. I had no idea what simulate meant. And he takes the goldfish bowl with a goldfish in it, and he puts it on the turntable of the record player, and he blows the fan over it, and he said, this is how ocean currents are formed. And I'm looking, and yeah, and he says, now we need to add the Coriolis effect. And he starts spinning the record player, and damned if he didn't make something that curved off like the Gulf Stream. And, other people, and he's telling me all this, and people are watching and say, what is this guy? And so that was my introduction to Howard Odum, and that kind of encapsulates it. I mean, he was so clever. He looked around and observed carefully, see things nobody else would see.
Yeah.
And put it into a teaching moment. So I think that probably feels very familiar to both of you. But that was my introduction. And then anyway, then it was the most fantastic day of my life. And, if somebody said, well, what do you want to do? at that point, there was no turning back, because I thought, oh my God, this guy is gonna teach me something really interesting, and he certainly did.
Good.
And I was really lucky in that I was a TA that first year. Oh, and another thing that happened was I got a letter of acceptance from the University of North Carolina. It was the most beautiful letter I'd ever received in my life. It was so Southern charm welcoming to me and so forth. And and I should add that although I grew up in Massachusetts and my dad was from New England farming stock, my mother was a Southern belle from South Carolina. And although well adapted to the north where she lived, and she told me, she said, Chapel Hill is beautiful. And so I mean, I was a little bit. And how did I end up applying to the University of North Carolina? I'm sitting in, I think, my limnology course at Penn State. And I said to the guy next to me, I said, yeah, what are you doing next year? And he says, well, I'm going to the University of North Carolina. And I said, oh, my mother said that's a beautiful place. But I said, I didn't know that there were any ecologists there. To me, ecology meant Michigan and Wisconsin and stuff like that. And at that time, and he said, well, I'm going to work with this guy, Alan Stiven, and HT Odum is about to move there. And I said, oh, I've read some of his papers. I really like his papers. And so anyway, all of those things transpired. And I guess if we're talking to younger people now, the most important things in my life is when you see the opportunity, jump. And that was true with my wife, which is the best thing I ever did when I saw her and jumped. And my big pickup line was, would you like to take the other end of the canoe? And when I saw this opportunity with HT Odum, I jumped.
Very similar to mine. Very briefly, somebody came into my office when I was working on my master's at U of F and said, you never guessed who the University of Florida just hired? And I said, who? And they said, HT Odum. And I said, who's that?
Well, that was probably the day after he signed my dissertation, because I saw the offer on his desk as he's signing my dissertation.
Really?
That said from the University of Florida.
Yeah.
And so
so you finished your PhD, and where was your first job after that?
I worked with George Woodwell, a wonderful ecologist, at Brookhaven National Lab. And later we moved our whole enterprise to Woods Hole in Massachusetts. Yeah. And then I started out at Cornell University, and I was initially filling in for Gene Likens when he went away for 2 years. And then I ended up staying at Cornell for 13 years. And, it was a good place in a sense because everybody in ecology came through.
Yeah.
And Whitaker was there, and I was really quite close with Whitaker. And I think even though he considered me to be a kind of slovenly hippie, he was very supportive of me. I think he really liked me in my way. I think, and I got along also very well with Gene Likens. And they were big deal ecologists at that time, and I think I was a brash, bright upstart. But the first course I taught at Cornell was limnology, and it had 64 students in it. Now, you go to any college, and their limnology course normally has a dozen or 2 dozen students in it. Right. Well, I had a course with 64 students in it the first year. In the second year, it had 128, exactly twice as many. And
The
I
word got
think that just blew the minds of these conservative old farts that, in the biology or ecology and systematics, I guess we were at Cornell. And, a lot of the students were really crazy about positive crazy and sometimes negative crazy, I suppose, about me. And I made a big splash. But I came up for tenure for three times at Cornell and never made it. Turned me down every time. And I remember the last time I got turned down, I got turned down for tenure on the week that I had the cover issue of Science.
What was their reasoning there?
They just didn't know what to make of me.
I see.
I mean, I didn't focus. I think they liked my estuarine work, but I wasn't interested in this or that or whatever. I was interested in
Ecology.
systems and energy. It was too diffuse, and I wrote papers on the atmosphere and in Nature, and I had them published in Nature. And I analyzed the Mauna Loa curve using techniques that I used in water analysis in New Hope Creek, and then that cover issue of Science with two of my students, Cutler Cleveland and Robert Kaufman, and Bob Costanza joined us on that. And it was called Energy in the United States Economy, a Biophysical Approach or something. And, what I did is I got really disenchanted with modeling in ecology. I thought there was so much bullshit in so many of the highly mathematical models. And I still do. And so I took 7 years off and studied economics, and found to my astonishment that the models in economics were worse than they were in ecology. Yeah, people were not starting from first principles. We're not starting from the observations. They were not. They were starting from the math, and I still think that's. I mean, if you're very clever, sometimes Einstein, I suppose, but Einstein says he only used math when he had to. The important thing was to think the problem through, and Odum was pretty mathematical in that when I was with him, more so than me, but his math was usually pretty simple and ultimately, and based on observations. And so I found it so just to the audience, I did my PhD on fish migration in New Hope Creek, and came up with this concept of energy return on investment. How much energy did the fish use in migrating, and how much did it gain from the process? And came up with the idea of energy return on investment, which is, I suppose, ultimately the most important thing I've done, because later Cutler Cleveland and I and Robert Kaufman applied this to looking for oil and so forth. So that's a more complicated story about what happened later. But I guess another thing I learned from Odum was to look for general patterns. So I had no problem going from the economy of New Hope Creek, which I had observed in great detail. And, I took 10,000 winklers. You ever done a winkler, Mark?
I have, but not 10,000 of them.
I did 10,000 winklers, and I would go out. I remember I was out there working on, I made what are called weirs, fish traps, getting fish moving upstream and downstream and so forth. And I handled, I guess it was 10,000 fish I really did a lot of field work.
Yeah.
And I'm out there working in my waders. It was cold and it was winter, and it's just ice would barely form on New Hope Creek. It's about the limits where you could do this study, I felt. And I'm out there working on trying to make sure there are no holes in my fish weir and so forth and so on. And I felt these eyes on the back of my head. And I turned around, and there's this bearded guy standing on the rock behind me. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I was trying to see what the movement of the fish was." And I said, "I think it might be," at that time I hadn't gotten the energy figured out. I was just starting and trying to see if the fish are important in moving phosphorus upstream and countering the downstream flow and so forth, and whatever I said. But I've thought about it later that George Woodwell, he said, who had graduated from Duke and had some money for a couple postdocs and went over to Duke. This was just about when I was not quite finishing up. And I guess he talked to Dan and some other people, and he said, anyway, so this guy, I said, he just asked me more and more penetrating questions. I said, and finally he said, "Who the hell are you?" And he said, "I'm Dan Livingston," who was at that time, more or less the god of biogeochemistry. And I said, "Oh," and so this was in Duke Forest, but I'm from Chapel Hill, but we had the research triangle there, so that all worked out well. And I guess that and some other things must have impressed him, because when George Woodwell went down to Duke and said, "I want the two best graduating people with a PhD in ecology," the people at Duke told him, he said, "Don't look here, go over and look at Tom Odum students." And George told me that twice. So anyway, I look at it now, and it was a marvelous, what I think was important was that I did the whole study myself. I did the hydrology, the chemistry, the
energetics.
the fish, the biology and the taxonomy and whatever. And I went back there 2 years ago with my wife, and I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. I mean, New Hope Creek is just gorgeous.
That's great.
And I was so lucky, so lucky. Nobody was there back then. And it was a protected area. I had the quote unquote key to Duke Forest. I had a little MGB. And I drive all around Chapel Hill with a MGB with these big fish traps on the back of it. And gosh, what an amazing opportunity for me.
So
And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in a stream.
Yeah. So what was it like the first time you entered and then continued in HT's course? Did he teach systems ecology at that time? Did he call it systems ecology?
Not initially. And let's see, let me establish a few things. I started out being a TA in general ecology. And at that point, I had a master's in ecology, but I had all these pieces, I felt. And what he did was, in his introductory course, he put them all together. So ecology went from being, a whole lot of different ideas into being an overview of how nature and systems work. And at that time, I wasn't interested at all in oil or humans or anything like that. I just wanted to be an ecologist. I wanted to understand how the natural world worked. And it was a marvelous opportunity for me to do that. So teaching his introductory ecology course, and And then he gave the first lecture, to my knowledge, on what became environment, power, and society.
Okay.
And it's funny because I missed the lecture. I had some legitimate reason for missing the lecture, but everybody was talking about it, so we all talked about it. And you know, we had a great group of grad students. John Day and Jeff Ritchie and Ariel Lugo were, I guess, the ones I was closest to, and still John Day is probably pretty close to my closest friend, and Ariel I worked with a whole lot in Puerto Rico and otherwise, and two people I hope you interview those two. I think, you know.
List.
And so but then I took my favorite course from him was not systems ecology. He had a seminar initially, and then he had I guess he had a more complicated course later where we had to learn all the math and stuff. Whew. And I did for one night. For one night, I understood his math. And then, but anyway, my favorite courses from him, my favorite single course from him was oceanography. And I think he was actually better at that time anyway, when he had a body of material that was, you know, oceanography that he had to transmit.
Mhm.
And so he stayed a little bit closer to nature and a little less abstract. And I suppose always, I mean, maybe it's just me that I was, you know, I was Eagle Scout, nature boy, camp out all night, you know. I was that kind of ecologist and not theoretical, I guess. And you know, I guess I got so turned off to theoretical ecology when I was at Cornell, you know, that I was noted. Probably what got me not tenure there was every time somebody came and gave a talk, you know, and they give all these math, and other people would ask questions about the math, but I would ask the questions about how does that equation represent whatever they were trying to represent with it.
Yeah.
So I was always much closer, and I look at this, what to me is a sad state of ecology now. It's all mixed up with conservation biology, and not, I mean, I think conservation biology is great, but that's something different. Ecology is how do systems work? What are the interactions of nature? How do they work? And, you know, how does that relate to energy and so forth? And so for me, moving from New Hope Creek to human society, it's just the same systems. They require energy coming in, energy coming out. And you structure the materials for the needs of the critters that live inside and so forth. You know, those beautiful pictures at the beginning of Environment, Power, and Society with you know, the oyster reefs and a city and how they're similar, and that little Indian encampment and the modern society. Those, to me, they really spoke to me. So I've never, as I get older, things get simpler for me. People talk about complexity. I said, well, it's simple. You know, there's a lot of details, sure, but the system is operating as a system. There are producers and consumers, and energy goes here and there, and you got to recycle the materials if you can, and whatever, you know. So I don't get worked up about either economists or other ecologists talking about complexity. So anyway, I felt I came along at a wonderful time to learn ecology from Howard Odum and to put it all into this overview, this big view. This is how systems work. And so when he then would talk about a hurricane as being similar to an ecosystem in extracting energy from its environment and constructing structure to keep extracting and even accelerate the extraction of the energy and so forth, makes perfect sense to me. Even stars, it's all beautiful, really beautiful.
So at that time, he was not teaching a course called systems ecology
My
or,
last year he did.
okay,
And
able to sit in on that.
no, I took it.
Oh, you took it.
Yeah, I Jeff Ritchie and myself and this Kathy Ewell. And I remember when she visited me once at Cornell, and I lived on Cayuga Lake, and we walked together down to the dock that was down the hill in front of my house. And we walked on the dock, and there she's all, a pretty girl all dressed up and all this stuff, and special lecture and stuff. And we're with, I don't remember, some dean or something. When a couple of mallard ducks fly by, and she goes, blam, blam. And I said, what was that all about? And she said, well, I've been teaching waterfowl ecology. That's one of my bread and butter courses. And that's what the kids in my class always do when the duck flies by close by. So anyway, okay, that's enough of Kathy. What else you want to know about?
I think
Go ahead.
maybe I'll chime in just briefly. This is I knew this would be an awesome interview, Charlie. So thanks so much for sharing all these great stories. I think one of the things we got out of Pat was the interactions with Odum during his work on his PhD. So I was kind of curious about how Odum interacted with you on your PhD work. Was he out in the field with you? Kind of what was his role in that process, and maybe some of the other students like John and Jeff and Ariel. Was he like participating pretty hands-on with them or helping out with modeling and so forth?
Well, I think he was more like with John, because John was working on his project that he got the money for down on the coast, and building these first, engineered ecosystems to process waste. And he came out with me, I remember one day in particular, but a couple of days. And I remember well, I'll give you a little bit more complicated story. I think when I was first there, anybody who knows me knows that I have, let's call it a gift for gab, and not necessarily a completely positive perspective. And I think while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do for a dissertation, and that was really important to me, to all of us, what are you going to do for your dissertation? It's not just classes. And I had already done a decent project for my master's with mayflies and their oxygen tolerance in the lab. But I knew I wanted to work out in a stream. I wanted to do, I don't know, a little Silver Springs or something. And so I couldn't find a good place to work. And I remember spending time with Bob Kelly, going around to all these different rivers in North Carolina, and they were all polluted at that time. And I didn't want to work in a big polluted river. Oh, I know what happened. Here's how it happened. We had at that time a series of lecturers, visiting lecturers. And one of them was Peter Larkin from the University of British Columbia. And he came and he gave a talk on salmon, on population dynamics of salmon. Oh my God, did that ever turn me on? And both British Columbia and salmon and the whole thing, and, I'm basically a fisherman in heart. And so that evening over at the chairman, that's Dr. Stevens' house, Odum grabbed Larkin and me and dragged us in a corner, you know, we're beer and potato chip situation. And he said, you know, I don't think anybody's ever thought about salmon migration in relation to its ecosystems. In that sentence, I knew I had my dissertation. Bingo. I mean, just what do you call them? Epiphany to me, you know, boy, fish, ecosystems, Odum, the whole thing mixed up. And so, and Larkin figured out so I could spend a summer at the University of British Columbia, and which is marvelous, in Nanaimo and all the salmon research. And I went up to Babine Lake, all kinds of marvelous things, but that's another story. Then, but I couldn't figure out where I do it. So as I said, I went around with Bob Kelly looking for an appropriate place. I went down and talked to the people. To me, migration, fish migration, I grew up in the coast of Massachusetts, meant, you know, salmon or shad or eels or something going in and out of the coastal rivers. And I thought about going back and doing it in a river near home, which I worked in years later. But no, that didn't make. And so Bob Kelly said, why don't you go out to New Hope Creek? I think that's what you're looking for. And I didn't know what New Hope Creek was, but I remember getting out of my car and walking across, you know, a mile of flat forest land, and then coming to this gorge, small gorge, with a river down in the bottom, and it was so beautiful. And I said, I don't know what it is exactly, but this is where I'm going to do it. And
Trout.
huh?
You traded salmon for trout.
Yeah. Oh no, there weren't trout there. It's too warm. Below my line. Off
Okay.
of my line.
You traded salmon for what?
So I had to make a big exception for Odum to go south of the line I drew back when finishing my undergraduate. So anyway, you know, the all assemblage of all kinds of centrarchids and
Okay.
red horses and all kinds of things. So a lot of fish though, and fish at that time weren't supposed to be migrating. And so the first day I put my weir and traps in, I knew I had a dissertation because I took out my traps. You know, the weir would funnel the fish going upstream into one trap and the fish going downstream into another. The first day I took out my traps, I knew I had a dissertation. And I was so happy. So Odum came out with me only once or twice. And while he was out there, I'm trying to weigh my fish real carefully and, you know, be real careful in front of my boss. And he's going off on all these theoretical tangents about what the migrating fish are doing and information and stuff. I didn't have a clue. And so forth, so on. And I remember, what do I remember from that day? He ran over a snake and just felt terrible. And I remember him not being interested. I was interested in doing every measurement as carefully as I could, and he seemed uninterested in that. He wanted to think about how New Hope Creek was working, and I mean, in a good way, good for me. And so I think he was much closer to John, for example, than me. I would say that I guess I give myself a certain amount of credit. I developed the whole project myself, pretty much, and he'd help me get the okay from But, oh, I remember when I told you, he thought maybe I was a lot more, show than go. And when we drove over to get the okay for me to handle fish in this way from the department, the State Department, but he didn't see anything happening. And so he said, at one point, he said, well, maybe you ought to look into getting another advisor. And, this threat of excommunication
Oh.
was, so I didn't talk to him for 6 weeks. And I went out and I captured fish moving up and down New Hope Creek every day. And I did a couple of Winkler series, 20, we call them diurnals in that day. I think it's a slight misnomer. And I came into his office with all that stuff. And the next day I had a summer support, and a week later I had money that supported me for my PhD. And I don't think he understood how hard I did work. And I guess maybe, I all of us were really hard workers. I figured I was working 80 hours a week, routinely, one way or another. And, we'd go home and Wade Smith and some other people, and we'd have cook supper together, Jeff Ritchie and myself, and all we talk about would be that lecture, today's lecture in whatever course we were taking from Odum. All we would talk about would be the ideas we were learning in ecology. We were so excited. And, we used to talk about the Odum dynamo, because while he's talking to the person about in front of you in the Odum line, you try to listen in.
Say the Odum line he's talking about was the line of students that were lined up outside his door waiting to
Following him at Chapel Hill. He was professor in 3 different departments, so he'd walk from one department to the next, and there'd be 6 or 8 people coming around, and each person at the front of the line would ask him his question about this is how he advised people about his thesis or her thesis, or whatever they wanted to know. And then they'd leave the front of the line, and usually somebody else would come along and join the back of the line. And so the line was always about six people going on. But you'd overhear them. And, we used to say it's like standing next to a dynamo. Your hair would stand on it, listening how beautifully people would come to him with an idea.
and then
he would answer it beautifully. I mean, a guy that was so abstract and so whatever he was so helpful to people with individual questions. And I remember at his funeral, did you go to his funeral, Mark?
Yeah, I put it.
Remember that, or whatever that was called, the celebration. That remember that local politician who spoke, that lady, about how when she went to him about wetlands, the next thing as a politician, next thing she knew, an hour later, he was standing knee deep in a suit out in a cypress swamp. I saw that all the time, on field trips.
Use on
What?
That's the picture that we use to
Yeah.
this whole interview process, is him standing thigh deep in a cypress swamp
In a suit.
around his neck, and a bow tie, and not a bow tie, but a tie on.
Yeah, a crappy old suit, a crappy old sock. But I mean, he knew he's supposed to wear a suit, I guess. And he didn't, he certainly was not Beau Brummel, but he was always respectable.
Oh, yeah.
Or something. He was real, and I want to say this about him too. I worked around a lot of high-powered people in my life, and he was a real Southern gentleman in this way. And the best definition of a gentleman I ever heard, I don't remember where I heard it from, was a gentleman, a real gentleman doesn't mistreat the help. And I mean, he certainly lit into me on a number of occasions, and certainly would light into other PhD people at conferences occasionally. But I never saw him light into a beginning graduate student or somebody, an undergraduate. In other words, what it means, a gentleman is someone who doesn't mistreat the help. He never, ever mistreated a person with less power than him. And I mean, the power dynamics obviously are important in university system situations. They're all the time going on, except of course at the University of Maryland, I'm sure. But he was always that way. You know, Mark, when you ask about how did he interact with me, I would meet with him once a week as TA when he's teaching introductory ecology, and I would go over to his house.
Yeah.
And we'd talk about whatever the very, very innovative, clever lab projects that he had. And I can remember sitting in his living room and it getting dark, and I would talk probably 2 or 3 hours each of those times, once a week, with him one-on-one, about ecology. And that was my real learning experience. And I guess I probably was good enough at asking questions, and I certainly was interested, that allowed him to put up with a lot of my other whatever inadequacies as a graduate student. But after a while, you know, I was not a brilliant student at all at Penn State, but after a while, it got easy for me, and I started in my other classes. I started doing very well, and even impressing the hell out of some of my professors. And I remember at that time, Bob Kelly and I went up to take a course in Great Lakes limnology at the University of Michigan, which I thought was, you know, more or less the place in ecology. And I got there and I realized that I knew everything they were teaching me, and they didn't have a clue about these other issues that I was learning from Odum, and were really, really interested in them. And so I began to understand what a very, very special education I was getting, which indeed was true.
Yeah. He's an amazing guy, for sure. I'm looking at my little.
Maybe put a bow on the PhD story. If there's any story about what was he like during your defense, was that a memorable occasion, or was he a Southern gentleman throughout that committee meeting, or he really grill you? Do you remember?
That was not my problem. My problem was passing the comprehensives the first time, because I was in the zoology department. So I had to take these tests on embryology and histology and all kinds of stuff. And so I didn't pass the first time, and the second time I did. My defense, I don't remember much about, except for one thing. You know, I think it was fairly smooth because it was my study. I mean, I was the expert on my stuff, and I worked really hard, and I read all the literature, and, you know, I knew my stuff. And so afterwards, he came out, I'm waiting out in the hall of Wilson Hall. Like another story. I was waiting out in the hall and he came out and he said, well, congratulations, Charlie. And I said, does that mean I'm Dr. Hall? And he says, yes, congratulations, Dr. Hall. And I said, that's the only time I care to hear it. I mean, I respected him so. And the amazing thing about Odum was how much he knew about natural history. You'd go with him to the beach and he'd know all the taxonomy of the seashells. You go in I remember going into, and this is something that people who would criticize him in national meetings didn't understand. He was one hell of a naturalist, but he didn't act that way.
Right.
And we're out in, I remember when we were doing a survey of a forest in Chapel Hill when I was an ecology student, TA. Wade Smith and I were TAs, and we did a quadrat of 1/10 of a hectare. And so we went and identified all the trees, and people would come up to him with a leaf and he'd know what it was, And so at the end of it, I remember a student saying to him, well, how many trees do you think there are in this plot? Because that person had just added them up. And he said, well, let's see. At this latitude, there should be about so many trees per hectare, but we're only sampling 1/10 of a hectare. So we want to do a log transformation. And I'm sitting, wait a minute. And then he says 43.
And the number was?
And then somebody's, I don't know, it says 42. and I said, well, that's impressive. And then some student comes wandering in from the edge and he's got a new species. He had 43. I did things like this. I had in those days, we didn't have distilled water, which as somebody said was our most expensive reagent. We didn't have distilled water taps in the labs.
Yeah. So
So we had to go over to the special room that had a distilled water meter and fill up a 5-gallon carboy and take it back to our lab. And I did use so much damn distilled water with all these winklers. And so I remember coming in one morning and somebody says, you better not, to Wilson Hall, which is where we were. I had a marvelous lab in Wilson Hall with Scott Nixon and Bob Kelly and Mike Canoy and some others. Nixon went on and became very famous in his way.
Yeah.
Anyway, I got tired of that. So I'm coming into the lab and he said, you better not go in there. Everybody in the building's pissed off at you. I said, why? He says, you tied the spigot down on the distilled water dispenser, didn't you? I said, not only did you use up all the distilled water in Wilson Hall, you burned out the still.
Oh.
Yeah, I'd gotten tired of waiting for the damn 5-gallon carboy to fill. And so I tied it down with a piece of rubber tubing. But I forgot about it and went home and, oh man, I could have burned down Wilson Hall. I don't know. So I had my tough times too. So I stayed out of Wilson Hall for 3 weeks.
Well, you mentioned how he was such a good naturalist and, was very comfortable naming taxonomy and species in any system. It was also true of his knowledge of the literature, the scientific literature, and could call papers and authors from really very broad scientific.
Physics and
all up here. you know.
all up there. Yeah, yeah, amazing, amazing. Yeah, yeah. Um,
So you were there when he was writing Environment, Power, and Society. I guess it came out, what, 71 was published? And then, I don't know, how was the time frame with that? And what did you see in
I was
terms of
there from
that?
67 to 70. I left, and he, I know he was thinking about it because, as I said, even my first year, he gave some of the diagrams that ended up in Environment, Power, and Society. And he said he was pushed into it by his wife, Ginny.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
Mm.
And you know, the two girls were girls then, they were not and we, I don't know, I would interact with them all. And I remember his brother Gene, I went down to visit Gene once and telling about how he got so flipped out by Ginny at one time because he was, you know, tall and awkward, and I think
Yeah.
wasn't successful, particularly with women. And you know, we're all young, hot guys at the time, and there weren't too many girls at that time, unfortunately. But and he was one of his earlier students, B.J. Copeland, who's quite a guy. He was walking around campus with B.J. Copeland, and some attractive girl in a miniskirt went by, and you know, as far as we knew, he paid no attention to women. And he says, God, PJ, will you look at those legs or something like that? You know, I never heard him say anything remotely like that. He never swore. He was, I mean, he was a real gentleman in many ways.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll tell you another thing he said. I mean, you get little looks into him, and this was a little bit sad. I've got to remember how this went. I was at some conference, one of Dick Uyghur's conferences that resulted in these big 4 books on systems ecology. And Odum went on with all these diagrams and stuff. And I don't know if you know how he used to teach, but he just lay these transparencies down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I told him once that I thought the thing that I said, I remember you as a fantastic teacher, but I know I don't hear that from your students now. I guess in your time, Mark, more or less. And I said, he says, yeah, I think I used to be better than I am now. And I said, I think I know why. He said, oh, what? And I said, it's the invention of the transparency machine. Because you used to draw out your diagrams with chalk. And we could follow each of your thought processes as to why this was connected to this, something else in a certain way. And we could understand it. But now you just slap down the finished product and people don't know where it came from. And I think, and he said, I think you're right. And I heard that he stopped using transparency so much.
Yes and no, but we used to accuse him of just before walking into class, dropping them all on the floor and
Yeah,
completely,
putting them up randomly.
and then just picking them back up and just, transparency after transparency. But
So
they
when,
were
so I want to,
unbelievable, mind blowing, no matter what, whether
oh
it was
yeah.
organized or not, and
Yeah.
because it's always mind blowing.
But he'd been doing all this thing with a lot of transparencies in a national meeting somewhere at Georgia. I think we were at University of Georgia, and he was severely criticized by other ecologists, and I was standing in a corner, and he came over to me, and I've never seen him like this ever, anything like this. And he came over to me looking like a drowned rat, a whipped puppy. And he said, Ooh, that was a tough session. And I said, yeah, it was. And he said, you know, I'm really insecure. I came along late and I wasn't wanted. And he had a brother, Gene, of course, and his sister. And for him, first of all, that was my first understanding that he knew much about human psychology, the way he said it. It was really very, and the second that this had been, I didn't see very much about insecurity about him. He was a man in charge in his local environment at Chapel Hill. He was the man. I remember running into an embryologist from Chapel Hill up at Woods Hole once, who I thought was very anti or opposed to Odum, being a more traditional zoologist. And I can't remember his name, but I ran into him in the library or something at Woods Hole, and we recognized each other and said hi. And he said, what a shame it was for us to lose the brilliance of Howard Odum. Do you know why he left? You know, and for him, you don't know what people are thinking, but positive or negative, you just often don't know.
Yeah. That was when he went out to Texas, out to the or was that when he came to Florida? Which one are you talking
Came to Florida right after Chapel Hill, day after he signed my dissertation.
Okay. So the story goes there that they just had formed the Department of Environmental Engineering Sciences at U of F, and they were searching for a chair, and he applied. Now, I don't know why he applied, but he applied. And he came down for the interview, and they interviewed him. And I guess some of the faculty had an inkling of who he was. And he said, to be honest with you, I don't want to be a chair. But I guess he was just looking maybe to make more money, get a raise back.
Oh, no, I can tell you why.
Okay, anyway, he said, I don't want to be a chair, but I would accept, something, a professorship or something. And the search committee went over to the administration, Tigert Hall, talked to the second in command over there, the provost, who was Ed Bryan. Ed Bryan was on the faculty of biology when HT was on the faculty back in the early 1950s. And when he heard that HT was willing to come to the University of Florida, he said, no problem. I'll give you a graduate research assistantship if you can bring him here. And that's how he came. They gave him a graduate research professorship, and that included a postdoc and a secretary at that time, and a couple of graduate assistantships.
Joni, she's still around?
I do not know.
Yeah, he was great.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I interacted with him a lot since, and Joni was always very, very helpful. Yeah. Well, I know why he went to Florida. He loved Florida ecosystems.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, I think he was very happy when he was at Florida before, and I think the engineering thing at that time was very important to him. And I don't think he was unhappy at North Carolina, but I also don't think he was happy. And he had a lot of really good students, and he had projects on the coast and other projects. I don't know.
Yeah. Was there not a lot of faculty support for him? I mean, was he still kind of an outsider?
I wasn't in the position. That's why this embryologist that I talked to, later at Woods Hole, I was really surprised. I don't know. We lived in our own world. Okay. And it was spread. I think he had actually some good support in engineering, because we had an environmental science and engineering department, and he was a professor there. And
Don't know. Yeah. But I do know.
I do know that he was happier at Florida than at North Carolina. And at that time, University of North Carolina was a more prestigious university than Florida. I'm not sure if that's still true. It probably might be. But I think I remember him saying, this was well after I had my PhD. I remember him saying to somebody about, talked about Yale or something like that. And he said, well, said, there's a lot broader class of what constitutes an excellent university now.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've just read crazy stuff about what's going on with teaching in Florida, that the governor is interfering with it and all that stuff. And can you imagine that happening when Odum was there?
No. I don't want to go there.
All right.
I wanted to go back to you brought up talking a little bit about his background, his growing up, and his dad had been a professor right at North
Oh,
Carolina.
big
So I was wondering if
deal.
there's like any kind of what kind of stories you might have about him and his dad and his
Yeah,
mom
I
and his
got a number.
family.
One is there was a graduate complex, housing complex there called Odum Village.
Mm,
And it was named after his father. Now, did you ever see his father's book, Southern Regions?
mm,
Great, big, thick book. And just tables and tables and tables of data. So Odum was always wanting data, and I think he got that from his father.
Yeah.
I think that's one reason maybe he did want to leave Chapel Hill, was he was his father's son still there, and he wanted to be his own man.
Yeah.
And I was walking down Franklin Street, the main street of Chapel Hill, once with him. I don't know what we were doing, and we ran into this black guy, and Odum was very, very friendly, almost like childhood friends with this guy. I don't know to whatever degree, but I never had any sense that he was in the slightest bit, Southern prejudiced or anything like that. And his father was known for looking ahead at the time, at his time, the 1950s or whatever, to the desegregation of the South, and considering that a good thing. And I think his father took some flack for that. I'm sure he did in some degree. I was, my mother was from South Carolina, but she and my father raised me to be extremely, I don't know what you want to say, but unprejudiced, or, judge a person by whatever their actions and what they think and not what they look like and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, my mother is from South Carolina, was in a certain sense the least prejudiced person I've known. But and so I was and that was the beginning of civil rights back then. And I would march in Hamilton, New York in favor of reintegration and whatever, end of Jim Crow. But I got to Chapel Hill where it was in transition.
Mm.
And then all the Vietnam War and the hippies, and I had hair down to here, and I really partook of the culture, Jefferson Airplane and all of that. But except I was a very, very conscientious graduate student. But all of that was going on, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question, which we'll get back to. But Odum, initially, we would go to Washington on the weekends and march against the war and stuff. And Odum, who served in the military in World War II, initially, he didn't like that. But I remember him saying, well, you know, it's on the weekend, it's your free time. You can do what you want. He said that to me. But then later he said, I think maybe you guys are right. Yeah, you know, I think he understood, you know, he was a little like my father. My father originally did not agree with what Frances, my sister, and I were saying to him about the war, but eventually said, your mother and I have been talking about it, and we think probably you're right. So, I mean, he was conservative in some ways. I think he was really a Lyndon Johnson Democrat. I think he liked Texas. He liked Lyndon Johnson. He knew Lyndon Johnson understood power and was impressed by that.
Yeah. Well, during our time, he would say, with all these hippies, you can be a scientist or you can be an activist, but you can't be both. So make up your mind.
And initially, we sort of wanted to do both. And he didn't say that to us because I don't think it had really arisen.
Yeah.
But I know in the first project that I did, which was to fundamentally stop a bunch of power plants on the mid-Hudson River. And the net result was that New York City didn't have enough electricity. So they made a deal with Quebec.
Yeah.
To support to buy the electricity from the James Bay project, and that flooded huge areas of Cree Indian hunting grounds and ended up putting the water intersected cinnabar mercury rocks and caused mercury Yamamoto disease on some Indians. And I took that personally. You know, I helped destroy these Indians, kill them. And I had this sense of a balloon. Somebody was blowing up this balloon, which was industrialization. And if you put out your hands and you say, not here, the balloon was still blowing up, so it'd blow up more somewhere else. And, you know, that's where we still are. And I work every day. I'm publishing still 3 or 4 papers a year. I work every day with people around the world, and I still think that the end of cheap oil is going to be far more important than climate change. And so I just published a paper on that. I don't know if I gave it to you, Dave. Send me an email, I'll send them to you. And I've just got a new one that will be hopefully accepted at the AAPG, Association of American Association of Petroleum Geologists, coming after a guy who had the temerity to criticize M. King Hubbard. I really lay into him, myself and some others. So I work on oil every day and on EROI of oil and solar and other things. So,
well, David was asking about his father, and I remember one time HT telling me that he remembers when Roosevelt got elected, that there was this constant stream of these big black vehicles, and these guys in these dark suits and trench coats coming to talk with his dad as they formed the New Deal, that his dad was a major player in formulating the New Deal for Roosevelt.
I hadn't heard that, but I'm not surprised. And Keenan, you know, at Chapel Hill, Keenan Library is named after Keenan, John or whatever Keenan he was, who was, I guess, the architect. I think he named the Iron Curtain and
oh yeah,
is associated. I mean, University of North Carolina. He had been president, I think, and he was a really, really heavy hitter in Roosevelt and just after Roosevelt. So I mean, University of North Carolina was a heavy political hitter, I think, at that time. I hadn't heard that story about the black limousines. And I never heard him say anything about his father.
That was the only thing I recall.
Yeah. He was very, that's why I was so astonished when he told me that he was insecure.
Yeah.
Because he was the least insecure person that I knew, I thought.
Well, there was another story like that. We were going to lunch, I think, and there have been a number of individuals that have sort of been attracted to HT that are sketchy. You know, they're on very fringe kind of people. David Science Man,
Science Man comes to mind.
and there was one or two others that I won't mention by name. And I mentioned that to him. I said, you know,
And he's open to everyone.
yeah, I said, and that was the question, like how or why are you open to these people? And he said, well, you know, growing up, I was the odd man out. I was not well liked. I socially had a very difficult time, and so maybe I overcompensate and treat these people with with respect as a result of my younger years as being the ugly. I think he even called himself the ugly duckling.
Oh yeah. I mean, he was awkward, and even in that book from his brother, on his brother by Mary Jane, somebody or another in Georgia, which is a great book. I wish she'd do one on HT. In that she says that HT or Tom, whatever they call him then, was the brilliant one. But the thing is, he talked so fast and he mumbled. People didn't understand what he was saying.
He did talk fast back in the day, I remember.
Well, one thing I remember saying to myself, I mean, you're getting me to go back and go through thought processes I haven't done in a long time.
Sure.
And incidentally, if anybody wants it, I've got my whole New Hope Creek experience written up. It's kind of interesting, and that has a lot to do with my interactions with him back then. But I don't have it published. If anybody can figure out a place to publish it, I'd like to do that. But anyway, I remember that thinking to or saying to Jeff or John Day or somebody that Odum would go from here to here to here to here to here to here. But the important thing was getting from here to here.
Yeah.
And as you got used to talking to him, you could jump over all the intermediate steps because you knew what each of you knew what they were.
Yeah.
And the ideas were coming so fast that you had to do that. You couldn't work things out in the slow way because you wanted to get over here somewhere, you know, and you get, as you talk, as you and he developed a talking relation, you go faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
It was really, I just, the 3 years I spent with Odum when I already had, you know, a master's in ecology and was very well read and all that kind of stuff, were such an astonishment of new ideas. I don't think I've heard a new idea in ecology in the last decade.
I used to talk to it, I explain it as playing in a sandbox. Playing in a sandbox with HT Odum was the most incredible thing in the world because it was all cooperative. There was never any competition with ideas and information and theory. It was all cooperative. You would develop stuff sitting in a sandbox, you know, creating things, and it was total cooperative play. It was wonderful.
Wonderful. It was the most wonderful thing, except meeting my wife, the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me by far. And I think it took me from being a mediocre fish biologist to becoming, you know, I've been successful as
A very successful scientist.
yeah. And all kinds of ways you don't know, Mark.
Sure.
And likewise you, I think. And Mark, since it's you, and I'll say this, I never did get on the Emergy train. I was very happy when he would talk about energy quality, because I certainly can understand that. Well, I'll tell you another story. Story time here. It's lovely. I was with him towards the end of his life. We had a series of meetings that both he and I would be there, and Sergio, probably you were at some of them, I don't know, in Italy. And I remember sitting at a restaurant, and he and my wife and his wife and Betty would often eat together, and it was marvelous because I was no longer the student. I was, and it was both about science, but about other things, all kinds of things. But I remember, and it was just wonderful. And we probably had close to half a dozen meals together that way in a stretch of 3 or 4 years, and maybe more than half a dozen. And he took me over to or we were just standing on a balcony looking over the Adriatic Sea and talking about something or another. And then he looked at me and he said, "You do so much work with energy." And I say, "I do." And he said, "How come you don't do anything on Emergy? Or why haven't you signed up on Emergy," or something like that? And he looked at me, I think, quite sadly. And I said, "Well," I said, "first of all, you guys seem to be doing pretty well with that." And I said, "In my case, I'm interested in the energy that gets used up. So if you use the rain to make something, it'll rain again next year. But if you use oil to make something, you won't have it next year." And to me, that's a profound difference.
It's different.
And and I said, "So I focus on, what I do. And quite frankly, to me, it's something that I can do with more rigor. It doesn't mean it's more important. And I will say that to you. It doesn't mean it's more important, but it's something that I can handle, that I know how to do it." And I guess I want to say one more thing about this. And it might have happened at the same time. And I said, "Well, you do an energy analysis of Italy, and you come out with the most important thing in contribution to the Italian economy in terms of energy is the tides." And I said, "I have a hard time relating to how that works." And he says, "Well," he said, and this was so characteristic that he would have such a good answer. He said to me, "Look at Italy. It's this hugely populated, highly industrial, highly waste producing area. And yet they have a high quality of life despite all the population and all the pollution. It's not a terribly polluted country." He says, "Look at the whole," and he points out at the mudflats or the rocky shores or whatever. He says, "Look at the whole edge of Italy. It's a vast trickling filter system."
Yeah.
And damned if it isn't. And he would have, that's another thing I'd like to leave with posterity, Mark, is that things that he would say that you'd think were crazy. And you spend some time, or ideally, if you could get his attention and get him to explain it. It's like putting in the chalk lines in between the points on the transparencies. He would have such good answers to things that initially you would think would be wacko.
Yeah.
And that's just an example, and it happened again and again. So I really like that in him, is that when you get, that's the problem. And he tried to get it all down. He tried to get it all published. I helped him a lot there by introducing him to Luther Wilson at the University Press of Colorado, who reprinted a lot of his books and stuff. So I felt that was something I could do.
Yeah, the systems ecology, ecological and general systems book was most
That
important.
is, I mean, I go back to that, a couple of times, 3 times a year, and look something up, and
Brilliance in that book. It's just
brilliant. Yeah. And I think I don't know how much we've lost it. All of the students are out there teaching, but I don't have. I've had 60 graduate students, and but none of them are Howard Odum, and I don't know who's coming along that's and I think it's so sad that people who take ecology now
don't many of them.
don't understand what ecology is. Ecology is about how things work together, how nature works. And it's not about the species list, and it's not about conservation. It's not about barely about how many different species there are.
Yeah.
And there's so much effort in ecology that goes into bean counting, and so little that goes into understanding how nature works. Just understanding the relation between production and respiration, and how energy is used and what for, and these basic questions. What is there? Is a I love the story of a bird, one tree in a field, in a successional field that's been abandoned from farming, and the bird comes out and sits on the tree and shits out a seed for the next tree, and I remember. Here's another story: is that we were in, I got two of them from Puerto Rico. I gotta tell you, so.
Okay.
We're going up and down the ravines in the highly dissected landscape of Puerto Rico. He was really energetic when he was younger. And so we're going up and down, and he says, and we go down into a valley in say 100 or 200 meter deep ravine. And he says, "What do you feel?" And I thought for a minute, and I said, "Sweaty." He says, "Right." And he said, "And what did you feel up at the top?" Oh, and I guess when we're up at the top, he said, "What do you feel?" I said, "I feel cool. I feel dry." And he says, "The most important energy source here is the dry air up here, because it's the gradient." And what's important about energy is the gradients, and the gradients between your wet, sweaty skin and the dry air. But when you go down into the ravine, there's so much transpiration that it's all sweaty. And so what he's telling me is what I'm feeling in terms of the physics of the situation. It was so characteristic. Or he said that the cecropia, when you have a clearing in the tropics, a big tree falls down, there's a clearing or something like that. And he says, now look at the cecropia. Who eats cecropia fruit? You know, and I think at that point I didn't know. He said, well, bats. And where do the bats nest? They or roost for the night, just inside the forest. And I said, well, look, he said, when these are fruit eating bats, and when they come out, you know, they're sleepy, and they can't fly through the forest. So they make a couple of cycles of the clearing as they're waking up. And he says they do the same thing when they wake up. They got to take a crap, so they're taking a crap, and what are they doing? Is they're seeding the clearing with the cecropia, which is the first stage of the succession.
Yeah.
And you know, he was really into succession and so forth.
Yeah.
And I guess in my own life, I want to say that as an ecologist, I wrote a couple of good papers, and I haven't written very many good papers in ecology, but I've written a couple of ones that don't get a good enough attention. And one is about gradients and oikos. And I listened to Whitaker for years talk about gradients, and then Whitaker died. Too bad. And I wrote, and then I began to understand gradients in terms of energy costs and gains. And that's all Odum combined with Whitaker.
Yeah.
And I think that paper deserves a lot more attention in ecology than it gets. I think it's the distribution and abundance of organisms as a function of environmental gradient or energy costs and gains along environmental gradients, something like that.
Yeah.
And you know, that was Odum's ideas could combine so very well with other ecologists. And now I work very closely. I meet once a week with Jim Brown and Robbie Berger and Chen Hu, who, you know, really good in other ways in ecology. And we write papers that, as Jim says, are a combination of Howard Odum and University of Michigan ecology. I don't know if you've seen these papers, but I published quite a few with Jim Brown. And so I have actually found that with the certain people, and Robert Whitaker and Jim Brown are examples that when you bring Odum in and are able to explain it in the language of the rest of ecology, they're very, very good ecologists are very, very receptive. But you can't just give them the paper to read. Although I have to say, Odum and Pinkerton, I reread that once a year, you know, and it's a marvelous paper.
Still gets a lot of criticism from time to time. All right, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, Charlie.
That's quite a...
Anything that you have not said that needs to be said?
I guess I love the man. What a difference he made to my life.
Yeah.
And he was so good to me. I mean, he was tough when he had to be, and he was inspirational all the time. And that's the first time I've said it. It's just never, you know, I spent my whole life in the Ivy League and at national labs. I known people who smashed atoms and made the nuclear. Then Oppenheimer film I went and saw, I knew some of those people. I never saw a person of the brilliance of Howard Odum. And he was a kind person in his way.
Very kind.
Wanted nothing more than, and I guess this is the tragedy, is that he tried so hard to get the world to understand these very simple things.
Yeah.
That are so clear once you understand them. They're not complicated. And yet they're basic, and it's two words for me: systems and energy. And you know, I've gone on and written all kinds of books that summarize my interpretation basically of Odum. I don't think I've had very many ideas that weren't fundamentally Odum's, repackaged in certain ways and applied in different ways. He was just a tremendously, unbelievably brilliant, not just in his quickness, and quickness we haven't talked about. I mean, he was quick and he was encyclopedic in what he knew, but he was brilliant in that he didn't come up with ideas that were crazy. He came up with ideas that, once you understood them, explained the world.
Very true. Okay. Thanks, Charlie. This has been incredible. Really appreciate it.
Well, how are you going to get it out there, Mark?
Well, we're going to host it on the Emergency Society website, and it's available. It'll be available on YouTube. If you want to host it on your site, it's perfectly okay with us. Just
Are you going to edit it very much?
No, hardly at all. I mean, we're going to probably stick something on the front that explains, what the whole series is about, but that's about it.
Who else you got? I'd like to see the other ones.
Sure. We got about 30 right now, a list. You're number 2.
Who's number 1?
It was Pat Kangas. He was.
How was his?
Huh?
How was his? Probably fun.
It was fun. Oh yeah. Then we've got, John Day's on the list. Bill Mitch. We're trying to do all the old ones first.
Yeah, I don't know how much longer we got.
We want to get John Day and Walt Boynton, and Pat suggested Martha
Get
Gillen,
Ariel Lugo.
Yep. Bob Knight.
Suzanne Bailey. Do you remember Suzanne Bailey?
That's another story. I was the one who introduced, just to tell you the story. Is the camera still on? No, yeah, I don't know. But
Oh, here, I'll turn the camera off.
We can turn it off. Turn off the
I was at a AAAS meeting